I was at work. I ran a school office at Ludford High School. I'd just given all the registers out and the children were returning them, and then it was my job to add them all up and get them all calculated. And then I would get on with my normal daily routine of running the office. All of a sudden, the lady who ran the nursery downstairs came up to me and said, "Eileen, can you come downstairs, please? There's a gentleman who wants to see you." He said, and he doesn't want to come up the stairs. So I said, "Yeah, okay, no problem." So I just turned my phone off and went downstairs, and there was a policeman waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, and I went, "I wonder what he's here for." And then he said to me, "Are you Mrs. Eileen Preece?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Would you like to come into the office? I have something to tell you." I said, "Yeah, okay." And then when I went into the office, there was another policeman in there. And the other policeman said to me, "Have you got a dark coloured car registered at your address?" And then he quoted my address, and I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you." He said, "There's been a horrific accident happened near the hospital." And he said, "I think it's your son's car that's involved in it." And he said, "There's a very serious incident and we need you to come to the hospital straight away," he said. "Could you please do that?" I said, "Well, yes, I must tell my boss first." So I rang my boss and told her, and she said, "Get off there straight away." So I did do, and before I went out through the door, the lady at the nursery slapped a bag of money in my hand. She said, "You'll need this for the farm," which I did do, need the money, and we went to the hospital. I followed the police car. The police car said to me, "Would you like me to drive you?" I said, "No, I'll do it myself." So I went to the police, followed the police car, went to the hospital. And the virtually A&E department stopped when I went in. It all went quiet, and I thought, this is funny. So they took me into what's a small room, and a doctor came in and he said, "Are you Mrs. Eileen Preece?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you." He said, "Your son has been involved in a very, very serious road accident, and the expectancy of his life is very short. I will take you in to see him now." And he took me in to this room. Scott was there and he was deathly white. And he said, "Come out," he said, "and we'll talk some more in his other office." So we went into the other office, and he said, "I'm sorry to tell you, Mrs. Preece, but we don't expect your son to live. He's got a massive brain injury." And then he reiterated the story. A 25-ton dust truck, fully loaded, rode into the side of him, and it bashed Scott across the other side of the car, and he sustained a massive head injury. They then took the hospital, went to the dispatched ambulance to get him, and they brought him to the hospital. And then I was met with that scenario when I got there. The doctor said to me, "I don't think that he's got much opportunity to live, Mrs. Preece. I'm sorry to tell you." And he stood there with some forms in his hand. And when I saw them afterwards, they were organ donation forms. My son was a semi-pro footballer, and he was as fit as a fiddle. He was really, really fit. And because of that situation, they wanted his corneas, his heart, his liver, his lungs, and his kidneys. I learned that afterwards, not at that particular time. But there was a young doctor there called Dr. Brett. He was a marvellous man, very, very clever. And he said, "Look, Mrs. Preece," he said, "I can see how fit your son is." He said, "I'm going to take a chance," he said, "because I want him to live." He said, "I'm going to ring up the multiple trauma unit in North Staffs to see if they've got a room to take him." So he rang up the multiple trauma unit in North Staffs, as it was called then. And he said to me, he said, somebody must be looking after you, he said, because someone, unfortunately, has just passed away in the multiple trauma unit and they've got room to take your son. Can you? I said, but I want my husband here. So they let me ring up my husband's place of work, and he was at that time, because he worked on the railway, he was shunting in the shunt yards at Radway Green. They got in touch with him, no messing. He was by my side within 35 minutes. They'd sent a taxi for him, they'd sent him to the hospital, and I got him, and then they explained the situation to him. And they said, please, can you go to North Staffs with your son, because we don't know whether he's going to live. And they said to me, my husband, would you please go inside and say goodbye to your son, because we don't know whether he's going to be alive when he gets to North Staffs. We both said goodbye to him, and they said, follow the police car and we'll follow you in the ambulance. So we went like the bats out of hell up the A500, blue lights flashing, till we got to North Staffs. And then when we got to North Staffs, we couldn't find anywhere to park the car, and the car park attendant said, don't worry, give me your keys, I'll find you. And he did, and he found us within half an hour. At that time, they took us into this relative's room at North Staffs, and a very small Indian gentleman called Mr. Singh came out to see me and my husband. He said, leave the situation with me, I'm going to assess your son, and I will come and see you as soon as I've done my assessment. He came back about an hour later, and he got hold of my hand and he said, Mrs. Preece, you have a desperately ill son. Mr. Preece, I will do everything in my power to help your son. And from that then, the nurses came and took us to a waiting room outside the multiple trauma unit. We went into the waiting room, and I didn't know at that time, but we stayed in there for 3 days and 3 nights. They wouldn't let us go home because they said Scott was on the verge of dying. He was at Glasgow Como scale 3, and that is virtually at death's door. And they wanted to turn the machines off if he deteriorated. I said, don't you dare. Don't you dare. I said, my heart and my gut was screaming at me. Don't you dare, don't you dare. Anyway, they didn't. But you know, on reflection, I still think of that now. How many people have believed the doctors let them do it, and how many people may not have had to die? How many people have just believed what everybody said to them? Anyway, having said that, they put my son into the multiple trauma unit. They put a plug in his head to measure the pressure, and it was in the left-hand side of his brain here. In the skull. They put it into bored a hole in his skull and put it into his skull. And they attached a machine to it, and the machine kept jumping up and down the numbers. And the doctor said to me, when that number comes down below 30, he's got a chance. And at that time it was well into the 40s. And we sat there at the side of Scott looking at this machine, and every time it bleeped, we took a deep breath in because we didn't know what we were going to see. We sat there for 12 hours, and eventually it started to move, and it was coming down slightly, slightly, slightly. And the doctors told us, go into the waiting room and we'll bring you if anything needs to be said. We were in the waiting room and we dog slept. We didn't sleep, but you can't, there's too much on your mind. So when they came to us in the morning and they said, how is he? And we said, how is he? They said, the pressure has come down to a reasonable level. It's not perfect, but it's reasonable. And when we went in to see him, they'd packed his head in little tiny iced sandbags, frozen sandbags. And he'd got a big wire mesh underneath his chin to stop his head moving. And all his head was packed with tiny little, only probably about 4x2 sandbags. And there was something in them that froze anyway, to take the pressure out of his brain. Anyway, that went on for about 2.5 days, and they kept bringing us food and drinks, and we were still in the waiting room, and because they wouldn't let us be in there when they were treating him, because they had to put drops in his eyes because and because they put him into an induced coma, and they couldn't wake him up from that until all this pressure had gone from his head. They then said to us, look, it's a case of a waiting game now. If he pulls through this, then we've got a chance. If he doesn't pull through it, then I'm sorry, the chances are he's not going to survive. So we waited 3 days, we were in the waiting room, till in the end one nurse came in one day and she said, the doctor said, you're not to be in here anymore. And I went, she said, but, she said, we've arranged for a room for you and your husband in the nurse's home, and you can stay there for as long as it's needed. So they took us across to the nurse's building. We stayed in a room there while Scott was recuperating to a certain extent. His levels came down. They weren't perfect, but they came down. And then, because he was in the induced coma, he couldn't do anything for himself. He wasn't in this world. So they said, we're going to nurse him now and get him as comfortable as what we can. We can't reduce the swelling. We can't reduce the anaesthetic that he's got to keep him unconscious. But we are going to do some scans of his head. And they took Scott, and it must have taken, I would say, about 10 people to take him in his bed to have a scan. I can't remember which kind of scan it was, whether it was a CT scan or an MRI scan. I can't remember that. But I said to my husband, I can't go in there, I can't go in there. And he said, I'll go in then, Eileen, I'll go in. So he went in, and he came out and he said, I've never seen anything like it, Eileen. He said his brain was like a big bag of mashed potatoes. He said you couldn't see any of his brain, it was that bruised. So anyway, they brought him out and they put him back into the ward. And they said it's just a case of nursing him now to see how he goes on, because anything can happen at any time. We then went, as I say, we stayed in the nurse's home. It was near on 3 weeks. And then they said to us, look, one day they said, his levels have levelled. And he's not gone down and he's not gone up.